Good morning. Barry Bryson here. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I held up the wrong book. I want to start with this book. This book is entitled, let me get the sun's glare off of it, Getting to Yes. And it's an old book. It was written back in the 80s, I think. Let me see. When was it written? Um, anyway, it was written in the early 80s by Roger Fisher and William Urey. And these men were with the State Department, and they had helped to negotiate the Camp David Accords. And it is a genius book about negotiation and persuasion, and particularly, as it says on the back, how to negotiate successfully with people who are more powerful than you are, who refuse to play by the rules, and who will resort to dirty tricks. It's about how you get people to do the right thing when they don't want to do the right thing, and you have no power to force them to do the right thing, and your hands are tied, perhaps even quite literally, and yet you need somehow to persuade them to do what is right, even though their impulse is completely against that. Um, we have something even better in the New Testament, and it is the book of Philemon. And we're going to study the book of Philemon as a textbook. We talked about Second Peter as a textbook. We just studied Second Peter, and we said it was very much and used as a textbook on identifying, addressing, and surviving false teaching and heresy from within the church. In the same way, First Peter served the same purpose, but addressing persecution from the outside. Well, the book of Philemon is itself a textbook of persuasion. And Paul writes the book of Philemon. We're going to introduce it, talk about who Philemon is, what congregation is he a member of, and things like that. Tomorrow, we're going to introduce the book in those ways. But today, I want us to talk about the book as a textbook of persuasion, and talk about the purpose of our study. We want to learn from Paul how to persuade people, especially when they don't want to do the right thing. What are the tools that we have available to us, the biblical tools that we have available to us? Because Paul uses them all in this short letter. This is what Paul wants. Paul, while he's been in prison in Rome, has established a relationship, and has baptized a man named Onesimus. Onesimus just happened to be the runaway slave of one of his old friends, Philemon, a man he has history with. And Onesimus is released from prison, and Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon, carrying two letters, one to the church at Colossae and one to a personal letter to Philemon. And this is what Paul says to Philemon. He says, what I want you to do is accept Onesimus as a brother. I want you to give him his freedom, and I want you to send him back to me. That's what Paul wants Onesimus to do. It's clear from the letter that Paul understands that's the last thing Onesimus wants to do, or Philemon wants to do. Onesimus has evidently caused him maybe some loss of income or some loss of treasure. He has insulted him, certainly by running away. Philemon is not happy with Onesimus, and he is not in any way um, 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 leaning towards doing what Paul wants him to do, what the right thing to do is. And so Paul, in the book of Philemon, um, uses every possible tool of persuasion available to him. And he is himself incarcerated and has no power to force Philemon to do anything, even to even be there to see to it that it gets done. It is a genius piece of work. It is like the Hope Diamond when we talk about learning about persuasion. Paul, the master communicator and persuader, puts everything on display in this letter, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at we're going to look at the book of Philemon as a textbook in how to persuade, particularly when people, as they say on the back, um, are more powerful. They don't want to play by the rules, and they may even resort to dirty tricks. How do you do that? Well, Paul shows us how. I want to say something about slavery in the first century, and I always have to, because our own country has a history of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery was not practiced in the Roman Empire, not the way it was done in the Western Hemisphere. It just wasn't. It's not the way it was done in Brazil or in the United States. It didn't happen. Now, there were galley slaves, quarry slaves that were treated as chattel slaves, but these men were prisoners or prisoners of war. Um, the only slave, excuse me, the only social safety net in the Roman Empire was slavery. And people who were slaves often sold themselves into slavery, went into servitude to pay debts, or handle debts or obligations they could not otherwise, or to find income, a roof over the heads of themselves and their families, three squares for their children, because that was the only thing open to them. If a man was enslaved, that didn't mean his children or his wife was enslaved. If a man was enslaved and he had a free wife and they had children, they didn't. Your children, a woman was enslaved and she had children. Those children were not born enslaved. They were born free. And so we're not comparing apples to apples when we talk about the American South and chattel slavery in the United States or in Brazil, and the slavery that was being practiced in the Roman Empire. Perhaps the biggest difference is that the Roman Senate declared that slaves are full-fledged human beings, which our Constitution did not do. Um, anyway, so it's not the same thing. It's also true that whenever the New Testament talks about slavery, the New Testament makes it clear that in the kingdom, slavery is irrelevant. That there's neither male nor female, Jew or Greek, slave or free. Galatians 3:27. We're all one in Jesus Christ. We're all equal in the eyes of God. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10, the slave trade is condemned as a sin, alongside some other terrible, terrible sins. And the only time that an individual slave is addressed and his situation is addressed, particularly in the New Testament, it's in the book of Philemon, where Paul says, I want you to set this man free. So, I know that's probably kind of a long disclaimer, but I don't know your background when you're coming to my 5 good minutes. And so we are not talking about the chattel slavery practiced in the United States before the 13th and 14th Amendments, or the chattel slavery that was practiced in Brazil up through the 1870s. We're not talking about that at all. We're talking about a different institution. So we're going to introduce the book of Colossians, or excuse me, the book of Philemon next time, and then we'll get into the text. And we're going to look at the text specifically to identify the tools. And I'm going to name a tool. Let's say it's love, or it's guilt, or it's accountability. And I'm going to say one tool is accountability. And then we're going to look throughout the book at the times that Paul makes and holds, Philemon accountable for doing the right thing. Well, that's what we're going to do. And we'll introduce the book properly as a text tomorrow. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.